of the reforms that were happening in the early to mid 1800s began to involve women. One of the earliest reforms to really include women is going to be abolition. The abolitionist movement included many women who were against slavery, particularly in the North. This is where a lot of them are involved in this movement. And many of these women also later become suffragists. They are fighting for women's right to vote. The word suffrage means right to vote. So what happens is that as women were fighting for abolition or the ending of slavery, they begin to realize that they too have very few rights. So that's going to push them to start fighting more for even their own rights. So some of these early women's rights activists are going to be Sarah and Angelina Grimke. This is one of the Grimke sisters here. They were both the daughters of a slave owner, so it made it very interesting when they decided that they were abolitionists and then also women's rights activists. Lucretia Mott is another women's rights activist. She is here. She is going to be particularly interesting. She was a Quaker, and Quakers had a very unique religious belief in that they believed all people could have direct access to God. So this is going to, again, really make that connection for them that not only should African Americans have rights, but so should women as well. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who is pictured here, was another major leader of these early women's rights movements. Susan B. Anthony, who goes on to become the very first woman who's ever she's on the dollar coin. Sojourner Truth, who was a former slave and also a women's rights activist. She gives a very powerful speech called Ain't I a Woman, where she discusses how she was treated just as poorly as other slaves, yet she had even fewer rights. She was talked about how she was doubly discriminated against, not only being black, but also being a woman. So you're going to see all of these women who are pushing for their rights. Many women were also particularly involved in the temperance movement or the banning of alcohol. The temperance movement is going to move to ban alcohol. Many women really saw firsthand how very bad alcohol could impact their families. Many of their husbands would get paid and then go spend all their money in the various saloons or bars. And a lot of times these men, when they would drink, would become violent. So these women, saw firsthand the effects of what this overindulgence of alcohol could lead to. Other reforms, we are going to see women going further in their education. Catherine Beecher was a big advocate for that. You see her pictured on the left. Oberlin College is going to be the very first co-ed college that included women at that level, and it's going to really start expanding across the nation. Health reform is also going to be key. Basically, women's health was not talked about. Their bodies were not talked about. So this just tried to make women more aware of what was going on so that they could be just, in general, more healthy. Women like Elizabeth Blackwell who pushed for this, as well as Amelia Bloomer, who pushed for more sensible, common sense wardrobe as well. We named Bloomers after her. The women's movement, again, women are going to be more involved in all of these various reform movements. And the idea was that it was okay for them to be involved because they were bettering society for their families. But one in particular, the Seneca Falls Convention, held in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848, is going to be the very first, what we consider the very first women's rights convention. While they're at the convention, they are going to agree and vote that they should have more rights. In fact, the only interesting thing here, or one of the interesting things here, is that the only thing that these women, this group of women, could not agree on was whether or not women should have the right to vote. So there were even those women here who believed that it was not their place. But what they are going to do is they are going to kind of write something called the Declaration of Sentiments. And this is going to kind of mirror the Constitution and basically claiming those same rights, saying, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal. So again, pushing for those women's rights. Now what's interesting here is that this very first Women's Rights Convention, held in 1848, we don't see the suffrage issue come to light until 1919. Women in society were held to what's called the cult of domesticity. And the cult of domesticity basically means that a woman's place was in the home. She should be caring for her husband, her children, the housework, and then, of course, was okay for her to participate in her church. Women were not supposed to be outside in society. They could not vote in most places, and they could not own property or keep wages. That means they couldn't have a job if their husband was alive. If their husband was not alive, then it was acceptable, but for the most part, that was not practiced. They were supposed to be in the home. What you see pictured here on the right is part of what the fashion was in the 1800s. Women were supposed to have very small waists and big hips. This could only be achieved through using a corset, which can be damaging to women's health. We begin to see workplace changes in the mid to late 1800s. We see the development of industry, meaning that instead of people making products in their home and having a particular skill, that is now moving to factory work instead, which was mostly unskilled labor. Because most of these factories were located in big cities, we see the growth of these urban areas, and we are going to see overall the cost of goods are going to decrease because supply increases, because these factories and industry are going to be able to produce these products at a faster rate. A lot of times, sometimes it was better quality for cheaper, which is going to allow for that price to go down. We've already discussed the Lowell textile mills, but we'll hit this again. This was, once again, a factory system that's going to employ young girls. In fact, it wasn't just a factory. They had a coal company town that was for their workers. Very strict control. Remember, they were having to provide and maintain the integrity of their workers so that their families, we just talked about where women were supposed to be, so they had to protect that in order to, so their families would be okay with them coming to work in here. But these conditions in these factories were very, very poor, and it showed that there were going to be some big problems later that are going to pop up that will be lead to labor unions. So we'll talk about that. But these working conditions were terrible. Usually we are talking about at least 10 or 12-hour work days. They worked 6 days a week at least. Very poor ventilation in these factories, so meaning their air quality was not good. Lighting was very, very bad, which can be very dangerous in a workplace that has a lot of moving parts and moving machinery. Very unsafe working conditions. To be injured at work was not unusual during this time period. So again, the fact that you have such unsafe working conditions with no benefits for any of the workers is going to eventually lead to labor unions and these workers going on strike. Now, a labor union, the entire purpose of any labor union in general, so when we talk about labor unions, we always talk, labor unions always wanted better pay and better working conditions. This is true now, and it is true even today. So that was the whole purpose of the development of these labor unions. We also see immigration, a huge flux of immigration in the mid-1800s. In the mid-1800s, our immigrants were mostly Irish or German. And when they came here, they usually settled in groups because it was more comfortable for them. They felt more comfortable with people who spoke the same language, practiced the same religion. Remember, Irish specifically are all going to be Catholic, and that was very different in our very Protestant country. So we do see them settle in groups because of that familiarity. But these workers often, just like very common that we see even today, were paid very low wages, and it is going to eventually cause problems with other workers because of that resentment over the fact they felt like these workers were taking their jobs. These immigrants were taking these native-born Americans' jobs. We see the development even of what's called the Know Nothing Party. The Know Nothing Party was a secret party, and it was based on nativism. Basically, they had a secret handshake, and they got the name Know Nothing because if you asked them about it, they would say, I know nothing. But nativism is not just seen in this party. It was seen really throughout the country, and it's where you favor your native-born Americans over any immigrants. And that whole idea of nativism, anytime you see an influx of immigrants, you will often see it in a rise in nativism or the resentment of immigrants because there were, just larger numbers, and they felt, Americans felt threatened by that, even though many of them, all of them really, had a history of immigration. But this is what we see towards the mid-1800s.